Sometimes the people who know you the longest see you the least. They trap you in amber, preserving the version of yourself from years ago, refusing to acknowledge that you've grown, changed, or accomplished anything beyond their frozen expectations. This is the story of how one dismissive comment from my uncle at a family reunion became the moment that changed everything, not just for me, but for everyone who thought they knew exactly who I was supposed to be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I pulled into the circular driveway of my cousin Jessica's sprawling colonial house in Westchester County, New York, the gravel crunching under my tires, like a countdown to discomfort. The August sun was merciless, turning my steering wheel into a branding iron, but I sat there for a moment anyway, engine running, air conditioning, fighting a losing battle against the heat and my own reluctance. Through the windshield, I could see them already, the Martinez family reunion in full swing. Folding tables, draped in red checkered tablecloths, dotted the perfectly manicured lawn. A banner reading, Martinez Family Reunion 2024, hung between two oak trees, slightly crooked, despite what I knew had been Jessica's 3 attempts to get it right. She'd posted about it on Facebook with increasing frustration over the past week. I turned off the engine and the silence felt heavy, final. No more excuses, no more sitting in the car like a teenager afraid to go into a party where she didn't know anyone. Except I did know these people. That was the problem. Nemfali mi asaya jas. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant Marcus. Kitchen brigade firing on all cylinders. Don't worry about anything here. Go enjoy your family time. I almost laughed. Enjoy, right. I grabbed the store-bought potato salad from the passenger seat, my contribution to the potluck, chosen specifically because it required 0 effort and would give my Aunt Linda something to quietly criticize later. Let her. I had bigger battles to fight than homemade versus store-bought. The house looked exactly the same as it had 5 years ago at the last reunion I'd attended. White columns, black shutters, the kind of suburban perfection that screamed, "We made it," in the language of mortgage payments and property taxes. Jessica had married well, a fact that my Uncle Robert never let anyone forget, especially when he was comparing her success to everyone else's supposed failures. I walked across the lawn in my simple black sundress and flats, nothing fancy because I'd learned long ago not to give them ammunition. Too dressed up and I was putting on airs. Too casual and I didn't respect the family. There was no winning, so I'd stopped trying to play their game. Maya, oh my God, you came! Jessica's voice cut through the ambient noise of conversation and classic rock playing from someone's Bluetooth speaker. She rushed over, all blonde highlights and enthusiasm, her sundress clearly from some boutique that charged $300 for cotton. We hugged briefly, the kind of polite embrace that happens between family members who follow each other on Instagram but haven't had a real conversation in years. Of course I came, I said, though we both knew it wasn't really of course at all. You look great, Jess. Thanks, you too. I love that dress. Very practical. She smiled, but I caught the slight pause, the way her eyes did a quick inventory of my appearance. Practical. That was Jessica speak for boring but appropriate. Where should I put this? I held up the potato salad. Oh, just over there on the food table. Aunt Linda's been asking about you. She's been managing the whole buffet setup. You know how she is. Jessica gestured toward a long table groaning under the weight of casseroles, grilled corn, and what looked like enough dessert to feed a small army. I knew exactly how Aunt Linda was. She was the self-appointed family coordinator, the one who remembered birthdays and organized gatherings and made sure everyone knew exactly how much effort she put into keeping the family connected. She was also the one who always asked about my little restaurant job, with the kind of tone usually reserved for discussing a child's lemonade stand. I made my way to the food table, weaving between clusters of relatives I hadn't seen in years. My cousin Tommy was there with his wife and 2 kids, looking exactly like he had in high school, except for the receding hairline and the polo shirt that strained slightly across his middle. He nodded at me with the distant politeness of someone trying to place a face. Maya, right? Tommy Martinez, Jessica's cousin. He extended his hand like we were meeting for the first time. even though we'd spent countless holidays together as children. "I know who you are, Tommy," I said, shaking his hand. "We used to build forts in your backyard." He laughed, the kind of laugh that was more about filling silence than actual amusement. "Right, right. So what are you up to these days? Still in the restaurant business?" Still. That word again. Like working in restaurants was a phase one, should have outgrown by now. Like collecting stickers or playing with dolls. "Something like that," I said, not bothering to elaborate. It wasn't worth it. In 10 minutes he'd forget this conversation entirely. I deposited the potato salad among the other dishes and was turning to find a relatively safe corner to occupy when I heard it. That familiar booming laugh that had soundtracked too many uncomfortable family gatherings. Uncle Robert. He was holding court near the grill, spatula in one hand, beer in the other. Surrounded by the usual collection of male relatives who found his particular brand of loud confidence either entertaining or intimidating enough to fake laughter at his jokes. He was telling some story about his latest real estate deal, gesturing with the spatula for emphasis, his voice carrying across the entire yard. So I tell the guy, "Listen, this market's not for amateurs. You want to play with the big boys, you better be ready to move fast and think faster." Sure enough, I had that property sold within a week. Full asking price, no contingencies. He took a long drink from his beer, savoring both the alcohol and the attention. Robert Martinez had been selling real estate in suburban New York for 30 years, and, if you listened to him talk, he was single-handedly responsible for every successful transaction in the tri-state area. He was the kind of man who wore his success like cologne, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. I tried to stay invisible, but Uncle Robert had radar for family members who thought they could avoid his particular brand of attention. "Maya, there she is!" His voice boomed across the yard, causing several conversations to pause. "Come over here, sweetheart. We were just talking about business." I considered pretending I hadn't heard him, but there was nowhere to hide on Jessica's immaculate lawn. I walked over slowly, like someone approaching a car accident they didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. "Hi, Uncle Robert." "Look at you, kiddo, still keeping busy with that restaurant work?" He said it with the kind of patronizing affection he'd been using on me since I was 12. Back when it was almost charming instead of completely infuriating. The circle of men around him shifted slightly to include me, their expressions ranging from politely interested to barely concealed boredom. I recognized most of them. Jessica's husband, Brad, my cousin Anthony, a few family friends whose names I'd never bothered to learn. "I stay busy," I said carefully. That's good. Hard work's important, even in the service industry." Uncle Robert nodded sagely, like he was dispensing wisdom from on high. "I remember when you first started waiting tables. What was that, 8-9 years ago? Good to see you sticking with it. Not everyone's cut out for the business world, you know? Takes a special kind of person." There it was. The casual dismissal wrapped in fake encouragement, delivered with just enough smile to maintain plausible deniability. It was Uncle Robert's specialty, making you feel small while positioning himself as the magnanimous elder who was just looking out for your feelings. The other men nodded along, their attention already drifting back to whatever story Robert had been telling before I arrived. To them, I was just another family member to be politely acknowledged before returning to more important conversations. But Uncle Robert wasn't done. He never was. "You know what I always tell Jessica here," he continued, gesturing toward my cousin with his beer bottle. "There's nothing wrong with honest work. Taking orders, serving food. Somebody's got to do it, right? Not everyone can be the boss." He chuckled, and a few of the other men chuckled along with him. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, that familiar mixture of anger and humiliation that I'd been swallowing at family gatherings for years. The assumption that I was still exactly who I'd been when I first started in restaurants. The complete inability to imagine that I might have grown, changed, or accomplished anything beyond their limited understanding of who I was allowed to be. "Still taking orders?" Uncle Robert asked with that same condescending smile, raising his beer in what he probably thought was a toast to honest work. "Well, somebody's got to do it." The men around him laughed, not because it was particularly funny, but because Uncle Robert expected them to laugh, and it was easier than asking questions or showing real interest in anyone else's life. I stood there for a moment, looking at their faces, seeing the casual dismissal, the complete lack of curiosity about who I actually was or what I'd actually done with my life. They saw a 30-year-old woman who worked in restaurants, and that was enough information for them. Case closed. File away. Move on to more interesting topics. I could have corrected them. I could have explained that taking orders wasn't exactly how I'd describe my last 5 years. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I smiled, the kind of smile that gave nothing away, and said, "You could say that." Because sometimes the best response to underestimation is patience. Sometimes you let people believe what they want to believe, right up until the moment you show them exactly how wrong they've been. And I had a feeling that moment was coming sooner than any of them expected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Growing up in the Martinez family meant understanding your place in an invisible hierarchy that had been established long before you were born. At the top sat Uncle Robert, the eldest son who'd inherited not just my grandfather's business sense, but also his tendency to hold court wherever he went. Below him, in carefully maintained order, came the rest of us, rated and ranked by achievements that Uncle Robert deemed worthy of recognition. Jessica had always been the crown jewel of our generation. 3 years older than me, she'd mastered the art of being exactly what the Martinez family expected a young woman to be: beautiful in an approachable way, successful in fields they understood, and married to someone who enhanced rather than threatened the family's sense of itself. I remembered the exact moment I realized I would never be Jessica. I was 14, standing in my grandmother's kitchen during Christmas Eve dinner, helping serve the traditional tamales, while the adults sat around the extended dining room table discussing Jessica's acceptance to Syracuse University. She was 18 then, radiant in a red sweater that perfectly complemented her complexion, fielding congratulations and questions about her business major with the kind of gracious confidence that seemed to come naturally to her. "Business, that's smart," Uncle Robert had said, raising his wine glass. "That's a degree that actually means something. Practical. You can do anything with business." My own early acceptance letter to culinary school was folded in my bedroom drawer, hidden like contraband. I'd been too excited to wait for Christmas morning when I first received it, but after overhearing my mother on the phone with Aunt Linda, cooking school. Can you believe it? I don't know where we went wrong. I decided to keep it to myself a little longer. "Maya's got her own plans too," my mother had said that night, clearly trying to shift some attention in my direction. "She wants to study cooking." The response was immediate and predictable. A polite pause, followed by the kind of careful encouragement adults give to children who've announced they want to be astronauts or princesses. "Cooking, that's nice," Aunt Linda had said, her voice carrying just enough doubt to make it clear what she really thought. "I suppose someone has to work in restaurants." Uncle Robert had been more direct. "Maya's always been creative, very hands-on. Not everyone's built for the boardroom, you know. Takes all kinds." Creative? Hands-on. Not everyone's built for the boardroom. Code words that translated to, not smart enough for real business, but we'll find something nice to say anyway. Jessica had tried to help, bless her. "I think that's so cool, Maya. I can barely make scrambled eggs without burning them." But her kindness only highlighted the difference between us. Jessica was going to Syracuse to study business, preparing for a career that made sense to everyone. I was going to culinary school to chase what Uncle Robert would later call expensive hobbies. The pattern continued through college. Jessica's internships at marketing firms were discussed at every family gathering. Her semester abroad in London became legend. Uncle Robert told the story of her navigating international business protocols at least 6 times over the years, always ending with, "That's the kind of experience that really sets you apart in the corporate world." Meanwhile, my externships at restaurants in New York City, working 18-hour days in professional kitchens, learning from James Beard Award winners, mastering techniques that took years to perfect, were met with polite nods and immediate subject changes. When Jessica graduated magna cum laude, Uncle Robert threw her a party at his country club. When I graduated valedictorian from culinary school, my parents took me to dinner at Olive Garden. The disparity wasn't lost on me, but I'd learned to swallow it. This was just how things worked in the Martinez family. Some achievements counted, Others were hobbies that you'd hopefully outgrow. Jessica landed her first job at a mid-sized marketing firm in Manhattan, starting at $45,000 a year. Uncle Robert acted like she'd been appointed CEO of General Electric. "That's how you do it," he'd announced at her going-away party. "Start at the bottom, work your way up the corporate ladder, build something real." I started as a line cook at a small restaurant in Queens, making $32,000 a year and working doubles 6 days a week. No party, no announcement. Just my mother asking when I was going to get serious about finding a real career. The thing about being underestimated by your family is that it creates a strange kind of freedom. When no one expects you to succeed, every small victory feels stolen, secret, entirely your own. When Jessica got promoted to senior marketing coordinator after 2 years, it was celebrated as inevitable. When I got promoted to sous chef after 18 months, it wasn't mentioned at all because I hadn't thought to tell them and they hadn't thought to ask. But the real turning point, the moment that would define everything that came after, happened when Jessica got engaged to Brad Whitfield. Brad was perfect on paper. Harvard MBA, junior partner at his father's investment firm, member of the yacht club, owner of a golden retriever named Wellington. He proposed with a ring that cost more than I made in 6 months, during a weekend in the Hamptons that he'd planned with the precision of a military operation. Uncle Robert cried actual tears at the engagement party. "This is what we want for all our girls," he'd said, his arm around Jessica's shoulders. "Someone who can provide, someone who understands the value of hard work and smart choices. This is how you build a life that matters." I was 26 then, working as head chef at a farm-to-table restaurant in Brooklyn that was getting serious attention from food critics. I was also single, living in a studio apartment above a laundromat, and spending most of my free time experimenting with new techniques and flavors. To Uncle Robert, this was evidence that I was still figuring things out. The wedding was a Martinez family production. Uncle Robert gave a speech about family values and the importance of choosing partners who understood the difference between dreams and practical reality. Jessica looked like a princess, Brad looked like a prince, and everyone agreed it was the most beautiful wedding they'd ever seen. I was a bridesmaid, which meant I got to wear a lavender dress that cost $800 and stand in a line of Jessica's sorority sisters, while Uncle Robert pontificated about the sanctity of marriage to someone who could provide stability and security. At the reception, he'd cornered me during the father-daughter dance, his own dance with Jessica having concluded to thunderous applause. "You know, Maya, seeing Jessica tonight, this is what success looks like. This is what we want for you too. A good man, financial security, a chance to build something lasting." He gestured toward the dance floor, where Jessica and Brad swayed to some romantic ballad, looking like they'd stepped out of a bridal magazine. "But first," he'd continued, "you've got to get serious about your career. This restaurant thing, it's been fun, I'm sure, but it's time to think about your future. Real stability. Maybe Jessica could help you get an interview at her company. Marketing's got good opportunities for women these days." I'd nodded politely, the way I'd learned to do when Uncle Robert offered his guidance. But inside, something had shifted. It wasn't anger, exactly. Anger would have been too simple. It was something cooler, more calculating. A decision forming in the quiet space where I'd stored years of casual dismissals and well-meaning redirections, standing there in my lavender bridesmaid dress, watching my cousin dance with her prince while Uncle Robert explained what my life should look like. I made myself a promise. I would build something that couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be diminished, couldn't be explained away as a phase or a hobby or a stepping stone to something more practical. I would build something that forced them to see me differently. 3 months after Jessica's wedding, I quit my job at the Brooklyn restaurant and used every penny I'd saved to put a down payment on a tiny, run-down space in an up-and-coming neighborhood in Queens. 1,200 square feet, a broken ventilation system, and a kitchen that needed complete renovation. But it was mine. Uncle Robert's reaction when he heard the news was predictable. "Oh, Maya, honey, that's such a big risk. Restaurants fail all the time. 90% in the first year, you know? Maybe you should reconsider. Think about something more stable." Jessica had been kinder but no less concerned. "Are you sure about this? I mean, starting a business is so stressful. And expensive. Maybe you could work for someone else for a few more years, really learn the business side before you try to do it on your own." My parents had said nothing at all, which was somehow worse than Uncle Robert's statistics or Jessica's gentle doubt. But I was done caring about their approval. I was done waiting for them to understand that what I did required skill, intelligence, creativity, and business acumen that rivaled anything happening in Jessica's corporate world. I was done being the family member who needed to be explained or apologized for, or at a key. For the next 5 years, I disappeared into my work. While Jessica navigated office politics and quarterly reviews, I learned everything about running a business, from food costs and labor scheduling to marketing and customer service and health department regulations. While she and Brad bought their house in Westchester and started talking about children, I worked 18-hour days, reinvesting every profit back into the restaurant, slowly transforming my tiny space into something that started getting noticed. The first review in a local food blog called us a hidden gem with surprising sophistication. The review in New York Magazine 6 months later used words like innovative and exceptional. The James Beard nomination 2 years later was what finally put us on the map. But none of it mattered to my family because they weren't paying attention. Uncle Robert was too busy celebrating Jessica's promotion to marketing director. My parents were too focused on wondering when I'd settle down to notice that I'd been featured in Food and Wine magazine. They saw what they expected to see. Maya, still working in restaurants, still single, still figuring things out. Which is why, standing in Jessica's backyard 5 years later, listening to Uncle Robert ask if I was still taking orders with that same patronizing smile, I felt something inside me go very, very still. Because they had no idea what they were about to learn about the life I'd built while they weren't watching. They had no idea that the little restaurant they'd never bothered to visit had just been acquired by one of the most prestigious hospitality groups in the country. They had no idea that the cousin they'd written off as the family underachiever was about to become the regional director of operations for 15 high-end establishments across the Northeast. They had no idea that I hadn't been taking orders for a very long time. Ha ha ha, I'd been giving them. Ha ha ha. The first winter at Paloma was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd expected the financial pressure, the 18-hour days, the constant fear that one bad health inspection or scathing review could end everything I'd worked for. What I hadn't expected was the crushing loneliness of building something entirely on your own. December 2019. The restaurant had been open for 8 months, and we were barely staying afloat. The neighborhood wasn't quite gentrified enough to support the kind of elevated casual dining I was trying to create, but it was too expensive for me to afford anything in a more established area. I was caught between worlds, too ambitious for the local demographic, too small to attract destination diners from Manhattan. My head chef had quit the week before Thanksgiving, taking our only experienced line cook with him to open their own place in Brooklyn. They'd poached my sous chef 2 months earlier. I was left with Maria, a prep cook who'd been with me since the beginning, and Jake, a culinary school graduate who was talented but inexperienced under pressure. The night everything almost fell apart was a Tuesday in December. We had 37 covers on the books, not busy by normal standards, but manageable with a skeleton crew. Then a power surge fried our main refrigeration unit at 4 p.m., 2 hours before service. I stood in the walk-in cooler, watching $500 worth of protein slowly warming to dangerous temperatures, knowing I had a choice: close for the night and disappoint every customer who'd made a reservation, or figure out how to salvage dinner service with whatever ingredients I could save and a backup mini fridge that could barely hold a case of wine. I chose to fight. Maria and I spent the next hour doing triage, moving what we could to the working refrigeration, calling every restaurant supply company in Queens to find someone who could deliver ice, enough ice to fill bus tubs and keep our proteins cold through service. Jake ran to 3 different grocery stores, buying every bag of ice they had. By 5:30, my kitchen looked like a disaster zone. Bus tubs full of ice and rapidly defrosting ingredients lined every available surface. I'd had to completely redesign the menu on the fly, focusing on dishes that could be prepared with pantry staples and the proteins we'd managed to save. The first customers arrived at 6 p.m. to find me personally explaining that we'd had equipment issues, but would be serving a special winter storm menu at a 20% discount. Most were understanding. A few left. I didn't blame them. But something magical happened that night. Working with limited ingredients forced me to be more creative than I'd been in months. The dish that would eventually become Paloma's signature A braised short rib with pomegranate molasses and herbs from our rooftop garden was born that night out of desperation and whatever I could pull together from our emergency supplies. We served every customer. Not only that, we served them well. Jake rose to the occasion in ways that surprised both of us, and Maria worked with the kind of focused intensity that only comes from knowing failure isn't an option. By the time we closed at 11 p.m., I was exhausted, covered in every sauce we'd made that night, and completely broke. The emergency ice and equipment rental had wiped out what little cash reserves I had. But I was also exhilarated. We'd survived. More than that, we'd turned a potential disaster into something that felt like a victory. I called my parents that night, sitting on the floor of my empty restaurant at midnight, too tired to drive home but too wired to sleep. "Maya, honey, what's wrong? It's so late." My mother's voice was thick with sleep and concern. "Nothing's wrong," I said. "Actually, everything went wrong today, but we figured it out. The refrigeration unit died right before service, and we had to completely redesign the menu, but customers loved it. I think we might have accidentally created our signature dish." There was a pause. "Oh, well that's good. You sound tired, sweetheart. Maybe you should just come home for a while. Your room is still here, you know? You could take a break from all this stress. Come home. Take a break." As if 5 years of building something from nothing was just a phase. One could step away from whenever it got difficult. "I'm not taking a break, Mom. This is my life. This is my business." "I know, honey, but do you know how much I made tonight? Even with the equipment disaster, even with the 20% discount, we cleared $800 in food sales. That's not including wine. That's more than I've ever made on a Tuesday." Another pause. "That's nice, dear. Just don't work yourself too hard, okay? Get some sleep." After we hung up, I sat in the dark restaurant, surrounded by the evidence of the night's chaos. Empty ice buckets, hastily written menu cards, dish towels stained with pomegranate molasses, and realized something that both broke my heart and set me free. They would never understand what I was building here. Not because they didn't love me, but because they couldn't see past their own definition of success. To them, working 18-hour days in a restaurant kitchen wasn't building something. It was just working too hard at a job that worried them. The acquisition offer came 18 months later, on a Wednesday morning in March 2021. I was in the kitchen, working on menu development for spring, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Martinez?" "This is Jonathan Chen from Hudson River Hospitality Group. I was wondering if you might have some time to discuss a business opportunity." Hudson River Hospitality Group. I knew the name. They owned some of the most successful restaurants in New York, from casual neighborhood spots to Michelin-starred fine dining establishments. Their portfolio included places I'd admired for years, restaurants that set trends rather than following them. "What kind of business opportunity?" I asked, wiping flour from my hands with a dish towel. "We've been following Paloma's success over the past year. The James Beard nomination, the New York Times review, the feature in Food and Wine. Very impressive work. We'd like to discuss the possibility of bringing you into our family of restaurants." My heart started beating faster, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm listening." The meeting was scheduled for the following week at their offices in Midtown Manhattan. I'd never been in a boardroom like theirs. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, a conference table that probably cost more than my first year's rent, and coffee that was better than what we served at Paloma. Jonathan Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of effortless confidence that comes from years of making deals that change people's lives. He was accompanied by Sarah Goldman, their VP of Operations, and Marcus Thompson, their executive chef and culinary director. "Ms. Martinez," Jonathan said, sliding a folder across the table, "we don't make offers like this often. Hudson River typically grows through acquisition, but we also believe in recognizing exceptional talent when we see it." I opened the folder and tried not to let my expression change as I read the numbers. They were offering to buy Paloma for significantly more than I'd ever imagined it could be worth. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The most shocking part was on the second page. You want me to be regional director of operations? I asked, looking up from the contract. Sarah Goldman leaned forward. We've been watching what you've done with Paloma. Not just the food, which is exceptional, but the operations. You've managed to maintain quality while scaling efficiently. You've built a team that performs under pressure, and you've created a brand that resonates with both critics and neighborhood regulars. Those are exactly the skills we need as we expand our presence in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. 15 restaurants, Marcus added, with plans to open 5 more in the next 2 years. You'd have complete autonomy over operations, staffing, and menu development across the entire portfolio. This isn't just about buying your restaurant, it's about bringing your vision to a much larger stage. I stared at the contract, my mind racing. Regional Director of Operations. 15 restaurants, a salary that was more than my parents had ever made combined, plus equity in one of the most respected hospitality groups in the country. I'll need some time to think about this, I said. Of course, Jonathan replied. Take all the time you need, but I hope you'll consider what this could mean. Not just for your career, but for the industry. We need leaders who understand that hospitality is about more than just serving food. It's about creating experiences, building communities, changing how people think about dining. I signed the papers 3 weeks later, after my lawyer had reviewed every clause and my accountant had confirmed that yes, the numbers were real, and yes, this would change my life in ways I was still trying to comprehend. The transition happened quickly. By June, Paloma had been renovated and reopened as the flagship location for Hudson River's new Neighborhood Classics concept. I'd moved into an office in Midtown with my name on the door and a view of Bryant Park. I had an assistant, a company car, and business cards that read Maya Martinez, Regional Director of Operations. But the most surreal part was that none of my family knew any of this had happened. They knew I'd sold the restaurant, news that Uncle Robert had greeted with relief. Finally, she's being practical, and my parents had seen as evidence that I was ready to move on to something more stable. They had no idea that selling the restaurant had made me wealthier than anyone else in our family. They had no idea that I now oversaw operations for 15 establishments with a combined annual revenue of $42 million. They had no idea that my business decisions affected the livelihoods of over 300 employees. They saw what they'd always seen. Maya, who used to work in restaurants, finally getting serious about finding a real career. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years desperately wanting them to see and acknowledge what I was building. Now that I'd built something beyond their wildest imagination, I found I didn't need their recognition anymore. Success, it turned out, was its own validation. But there was still a part of me, a small, stubborn part that remembered the 14-year-old girl hiding her culinary school acceptance letter, that wondered what it would feel like if they actually knew. Not because I needed their approval, but because I wanted them to understand that the path they'd dismissed as impractical had led to something extraordinary. That part of me was about to get its chance. Because in 3 days, I would be standing in Jessica's backyard, listening to Uncle Robert make jokes about me still taking orders, completely unaware that I'd been giving them for the past 2 years to some of the most respected chefs in New York City. And unlike every other family gathering where I'd swallowed their assumptions and changed the subject, this time I wasn't going to let it slide. This time, they were going to learn exactly what I'd been building while they weren't paying attention. After Uncle Robert's dismissive comment about me still taking orders, the conversation around the grill shifted back to safer territory, his latest real estate conquests and Brad's analysis of the stock market. I stood there for another few minutes, nursing my drink and listening to them discuss portfolio diversification like they were decoding the secrets of the universe. The key, Brad was saying, adjusting his polo shirt collar, is understanding that traditional investment vehicles are becoming obsolete. You need to think outside the box. Cryptocurrency, NFTs, alternative assets. Uncle Robert nodded sagely. That's exactly what I've been telling my clients. Diversification is everything. Can't put all your eggs in one basket, especially in this economy. I almost laughed. Uncle Robert's idea of diversification was selling houses in both Nassau and Suffolk counties. But I kept my expression neutral, playing the role I'd perfected over decades of family gatherings. The quiet cousin who listened politely while the men discussed important matters. Maya probably doesn't know much about investments, Anthony chimed in, giving me a sympathetic look. Restaurant work doesn't really leave time for that kind of financial planning, right? There it was again. The casual assumption that working in food service meant I lived paycheck to paycheck, too focused on immediate survival to think about long-term wealth building. The patronizing tone that suggested financial literacy was beyond my capabilities. Actually, I started, but Uncle Robert was already moving on. Speaking of restaurants, he said, clapping Brad on the shoulder, we should take the wives to that new place in the city. What's it called, Maria? Jessica's been wanting to try it for their anniversary. Maria's good, I said quietly. Though if you're looking for Italian, I'd recommend Resdora. They just got their Michelin star and the pasta is exceptional. The group turned to look at me with surprise, as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Oh, you know about Michelin stars? Jessica's husband asked, his tone suggesting this was roughly equivalent to a toddler knowing calculus. I read about restaurants sometimes, I said, keeping my voice even. I didn't mention that I'd eaten at Resdora 3 times. Twice for research and once when their executive chef had invited me to try their new tasting menu. I didn't mention that the chef and I had discussed sourcing strategies and labor costs over wine that cost more than Anthony probably spent on groceries in a month. That's sweet, Jessica said, appearing at my elbow with a fresh drink. Maya's always been interested in food. Remember when we were kids, she used to watch the Food Network constantly? Sweet. Interested in food? Like I was still 12 years old, fascinated by cartoons. I remember that, Aunt Linda said, joining our circle with the purposeful stride of someone about to share wisdom. Maya was always cooking something. I used to worry she'd burn the house down. She made those elaborate birthday cakes, my mother added, as if she'd been summoned by the mention of my childhood. Remember the castle cake for Jessica's Sweet 16? Took her 3 days. That was beautiful, Jessica said warmly. I still have pictures somewhere. I remembered that cake. I'd taught myself advanced decorating techniques from library books, spending my own babysitting money on specialty ingredients and tools. It had 4 towers, working drawbridge made from sugarwork, and fondant figures that I'd hand-sculpted. The adults had oohed and ahhed over it for about 5 minutes before moving on to discussing Jessica's party dress and the DJ they'd hired. Maya should have gone to art school instead of that cooking program, Aunt Linda continued. She was always so creative. Could have been a teacher or something stable. Cooking school was expensive enough, my father said, appearing with a plate of Uncle Robert's grilled chicken. Art school would have been even worse. At least with the restaurant training, she learned some practical skills. Practical skills? Like I'd attended vocational school to learn a trade, rather than studying under James Beard Award winners and mastering techniques that took years to perfect. The important thing is that she's happy, my mother said, using the tone people reserve for discussing relatives with chronic illnesses. Not everyone needs to climb the corporate ladder. Maya's always been more of a free spirit. Free spirit. Translation, lacks ambition and business sense. That's true, Uncle Robert said, rejoining the conversation with the authority of someone whose opinion had been requested. Maya's got that artistic temperament. Very creative, but not really built for the business world. Different kinds of intelligence, you know? Different kinds of intelligence. I'd heard that phrase applied to me since I was 16. It was family code for smart enough to be interesting at dinner parties, but not smart enough for real success. The circle of relatives nodded in agreement, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to mildly condescending. They'd diagnosed me and filed me away. The creative cousin who'd never quite figured out how to monetize her talents. Still, Brad said, clearly trying to be encouraging, there's something to be said for following your passion. Not everyone can handle the stress of corporate life. Takes a certain kind of person. A certain kind of person. Someone unlike me, obviously. Maya's got a good heart, Jessica added. She's always been more about helping people than making money. That's admirable. Helping people versus making money. As if the two were mutually exclusive. As if building a successful business couldn't involve both. I stood there listening to them dissect my personality and career choices like I was a case study in alternative life paths. Every comment was delivered with kindness, wrapped in the soft language of familial love and concern. No one was trying to be cruel. They genuinely believed they were being supportive. That made it worse. If they'd been openly dismissive, I could have argued back. If they'd been intentionally cruel, I could have defended myself. But this gentle, persistent underestimation was harder to fight, because it came disguised as care. They cared about me. They worried about my financial security. They wanted me to be happy. They just couldn't imagine that I might have found both success and happiness in ways they didn't understand. You know what Maya should do, Aunt Linda said, warming to her subject, is find someone nice to settle down with, someone stable, with a good job. Then she wouldn't have to worry so much about making ends meet. Find someone to take care of me. Because obviously, I couldn't take care of myself. That's not a bad idea, Uncle Robert agreed. A woman in the service industry. It's tough to build long-term security on that kind of income. Better to find a partner who can provide stability. My mother looked uncomfortable. Maya's very independent. She's never been one to rely on other people. Independence is fine when you're young, Aunt Linda said dismissively. But eventually, you need to think about the future. Retirement, healthcare, buying a house. These things matter. As if I hadn't thought about any of these things. As if I didn't have a 401k that was growing faster than most of their investment portfolios. As if I didn't own a 2-bedroom condo in Manhattan with a mortgage I could pay off early if I wanted to. Maya's doing fine, Jessica said, loyalty kicking in, even as she clearly agreed with the general sentiment. She's got her apartment, she's got her job, she's stable enough. Stable enough. The kind of stability you'd wish for a child. Basic, adequate, nothing to worry about. I'm just saying, Uncle Robert continued, it's never too late to pivot. Maya's still young. She could go back to school, get an MBA, transition into the business side of the hospitality industry. Use that restaurant experience as a foundation for something bigger. Something bigger. Because what I was doing now was inherently small. That's actually not a terrible idea, Brad said, getting excited about the possibility of rescuing me from my limited circumstances. With her background, she could probably get into a decent program. Maybe not Wharton or Harvard, but there are plenty of good regional schools. Not Wharton or Harvard, but maybe somewhere good enough for someone like me. I could help with the application process, Jessica offered. I still have contacts at Syracuse. And Brad knows people in admissions at some of the local business schools. They were planning my salvation, designing a path that would finally transform me into someone they could understand and be proud of. Someone who'd given up the creative nonsense and joined the real world of quarterly reports and performance reviews. The conversation continued around me, each suggestion more helpful than the last. Community college to start, maybe. Part-time programs for working adults. Financial aid for career changers. They were trying to solve the problem of Maya, the family member who'd somehow gotten off track and needed gentle redirection back to the path of conventional success. I could have stopped them. I could have explained that I'd already transitioned to the business side of hospitality, that I was already making more money than most of them, that my restaurant experience had led to exactly the kind of success they thought I should be pursuing. But something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity about how far they'd go in planning my rehabilitation. Maybe it was the perverse satisfaction of knowing something they didn't. Maybe it was just exhaustion from years of fighting the same battle at every family gathering. Or maybe it was the realization that their concern wasn't really about me at all. It was about their own discomfort with having a family member who didn't fit their narrative of success. They needed me to be struggling so they could feel better about their own choices. They needed me to be grateful for their advice so they could feel important and wise. Pause. My success would disrupt that dynamic in ways they weren't prepared for. So I let them plan my future, nodding occasionally and making non-committal sounds while they designed a life that would finally make sense to them. I let them worry about my retirement and my healthcare and my housing situation. I let them discuss my limitations and my potential, like I was a project they'd all agreed to take on. Because in a few hours, when the opportunity was right, I was going to show them exactly how wrong they'd been about everything. And unlike every other family gathering where their assumptions had gone unchallenged, this time there would be consequences for their casual dismissal of what I'd built. This time, they were going to learn that the cousin they'd been trying to save had never needed saving at all. The catalyst came from an unexpected source, Jessica's 7-year-old daughter, Emma. I was standing near the dessert table, half listening to my cousin Anthony explain why cryptocurrency was the future of finance, when Emma tugged on my dress. "Aunt Maya," she said in that direct way children have before they learn to be polite. "My friend Sophia's mom says you're famous." The adult conversation stopped mid-sentence. Anthony paused with his beer halfway to his mouth. Aunt Linda, who'd been arranging brownies on a platter, looked up sharply. "Famous?" Jessica laughed, appearing beside her daughter. "Emma, what are you talking about?" "Sophia's mom works at that restaurant place, the one with the big windows in the city." She showed Sophia a picture in a magazine and said, "That's your friend's Aunt Maya. She's very important in the restaurant business." Emma looked at me with the kind of serious expression that only children can manage. "Are you important, Aunt Maya?" The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica looked confused. Anthony was staring at me like I'd suddenly grown a second head. Aunt Linda had stopped mid-brownie arrangement, her mouth slightly open. "What magazine?" Jessica asked slowly. "I don't know," Emma said with a shrug. "But Sophia's mom was really excited. She said you were in it because you're the boss of lots of restaurants now." Boss of lots of restaurants. Out of the mouths of babes. Boassa Samika. I felt every adult within earshot turn their attention to me. The casual background chatter of the party seemed to fade as neighbors and relatives began to tune into our conversation. "Maya?" My mother's voice carried a note I'd never heard before. Uncertainty mixed with something that might have been hope. What is Emma talking about? This was it. The moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since Uncle Robert's dismissive comment 2 hours earlier. I could deflect, change the subject, minimize what Emma had heard. Or I could finally tell them the truth about what I'd been building, while they weren't paying attention. Hey, I chose the truth. Emma's friend's mother probably works at one of our Hudson River locations, I said calmly. We have several restaurants in Manhattan. Our? Jessica repeated. Hudson River Hospitality Group. I'm the Regional Director of Operations. The words hung in the air like smoke. I watched as the adults around me tried to process what I'd just said, their faces cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching comprehension. Regional Director of what now? Anthony said finally. Operations. I oversee 15 restaurants across the Northeast. We're opening 5 more locations in the next 2 years. Uncle Robert materialized at my elbow as if summoned by some internal radar that detected significant conversations happening without him. What's all this about restaurants? He asked with his usual booming confidence. Maya says she's some kind of director, Anthony said, still sounding bewildered. Director of Operations for Hudson River Hospitality Group, I repeated, my voice steady. We acquired my restaurant, Paloma, 2 years ago. They offered me a position overseeing operations for their expansion into Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. Uncle Robert's expression shifted from casual interest to sharp attention. Hudson River? I know that name. They own... He stopped, his brain clearly working to connect dots he'd never bothered to examine before. They own Maria. And that place in Soho? Osteria Marini. Among others, I confirmed. You work for them? He asked, his voice dropping the condescending tone I'd heard all afternoon. I work with them. I'm part of the senior management team. The circle around us had grown. Word was spreading through the party like ripples in a pond. I could see more relatives drifting over, drawn by the unusual energy of a conversation that didn't follow the normal family gathering script. But you sold your restaurant, my father said, appearing with my mother close behind. You said you were done with all that. I said I sold Paloma. I didn't say I was done with the restaurant business. Maya, my mother said carefully, are you saying you have some kind of corporate job now? Corporate job. Even now, she couldn't quite bring herself to believe that I might have achieved the kind of success they'd been encouraging me to pursue for years. I'm saying I run the operations for a $42 million division of one of the most respected hospitality groups in New York. The number hit them like a physical force. I watched Uncle Robert's face go through a series of calculations. trying to figure out what kind of salary someone in my position might command. 42 million? Jessica whispered. Annual revenue across all locations, I confirmed. And you manage all of that? Brad asked, his earlier condescension replaced by something approaching respect. I manage the operations, staffing, menu development, quality control, expansion planning, vendor relationships, cost analysis. I paused, looking around the circle of faces that were all focused on me, with an intensity I'd never experienced at a family gathering. The things you'd learn in business school. The comment was directed at Uncle Robert, who'd spent an hour explaining why I should go back to school to learn business fundamentals. Jesus, Maya, Anthony breathed. Why didn't you ever tell us any of this? You never asked. The simplicity of that statement seemed to hit them harder than any of the details about my job. Because it was true. In 2 years since the acquisition, through multiple family gatherings and holiday calls, not one of them had asked about my work beyond the most basic pleasantries. We didn't know, my mother said softly. Because you never wanted to know, I replied, not harshly, just factually. Every time I tried to talk about the business side of what I was doing, you changed the subject, or suggested I should be doing something else instead. Uncle Robert cleared his throat, and I could see him trying to regain control of the conversation. Well, that's wonderful, Maya. Really impressive. I always knew you had potential. Always knew. The revision of history was immediate and shameless. You told me 3 hours ago that not everyone was built for the boardroom, I said quietly. I meant, well, I didn't know about all this. He gestured vaguely, as if my career was a new accessory I just put on. If you'd mentioned the corporate position, would it have mattered? I asked. Would you have treated me differently if you'd known I was giving orders instead of taking them? The phrase landed like I'd intended it to, a direct callback to his earlier dismissal, now revealed as absurdly wrong. Maya, Jessica said, stepping closer, I had no idea. I mean, I knew you were smart, but this level of responsibility is what I've been building toward for 10 years, I said. While you were celebrating my decisions to get out of restaurants, I was actually getting deeper into the business side of the industry. While you were worrying about my financial stability, I was negotiating acquisition deals and expansion strategies. The crowd around us had grown to include most of the party guests. Conversations had stopped throughout the yard as people realized something significant was happening near the dessert table. How much? Anthony started, then stopped himself. How much do I make? I finished his question. More than anyone else in this family. Uncle Robert's face had gone through several color changes during this exchange. Maya, I think there might be some confusion here. Regional director sounds impressive, but what, Uncle Robert? I asked. But someone like me couldn't possibly have achieved something like this? But my restaurant experience couldn't have translated into real business success? That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. It's what you've all meant for years. That what I was doing was cute, or creative, or admirable in its own small way, but not serious. Not real business. My father stepped forward, looking stricken. Maya, we're proud of you. We've always been proud. You've been embarrassed by me, I corrected, worried about me, concerned that I wasn't living up to my potential. But proud? When's the last time any of you asked about my work with genuine interest instead of polite obligation? The question hung in the air. I could see them all searching their memories, trying to find instances of genuine curiosity about my career. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. I remember, Emma said suddenly, her clear voice cutting through the adult tension. At Christmas, when the grown-ups were talking about work, Aunt Maya tried to tell everyone about her restaurant being in a magazine. But then Uncle Robert started talking about selling houses, and everyone stopped listening to her. Children, I thought, see everything. Emma, Jessica said quickly, why don't you go find Daddy? But Emma's observation had done its damage. The moment she'd described was specific enough that everyone could remember it. The awkward transition when my news had been brushed aside in favor of Uncle Robert's latest real estate triumph. That magazine was Food and Wine, I said quietly. The article was about innovative approaches to neighborhood dining. They featured Paloma as one of the top 5 restaurants to watch in Queens. My mother's hand went to her mouth. "We didn't know," she whispered. "Because you didn't ask about the details. You heard magazine article and nodded politely and moved on." "We should have," my father started. "You should have seen me," I said simply. "Not who you thought I should be, or who you were worried I wasn't becoming. Just me, and what I was actually building." The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This wasn't the pause of people trying to process new information. This was the silence of people confronting a truth they'd been avoiding for years. Uncle Robert, to his credit, was the first to break it. "Maya," he said, his voice lacking its usual authority, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." "Yes," I said simply. "You do." The word hung between us like a challenge. Not an acceptance of his apology, just an acknowledgement that it was indeed owed. Because this wasn't about forgiveness. This was about recognition. And finally, surrounded by family members who were seeing me clearly for the first time in decades, I had it. The transformation was immediate and uncomfortable to watch. Within minutes of my revelation, the entire dynamic of the family reunion shifted like tectonic plates rearranging themselves. People who had barely acknowledged my presence suddenly found reasons to drift closer to our group. Conversations that had been flowing naturally around the yard now seemed forced, artificial, as if everyone was performing normalcy while processing this new information about the family member they thought they knew. Anthony was the first to fully recalibrate. "Maya, I have to ask, and stop me if this is too personal, but what kind of equity stake do you have in Hudson River?" The question came with a different tone than any he'd used with me before. No longer the patient cousin explaining basic financial concepts to the family member who, quote, wouldn't understand. This was the voice he used with his investment banking colleagues, direct and respectful and genuinely interested in the answer. "Significant enough that I have a seat on the expansion committee," I said simply. I watched him do the mental calculations. Anthony worked in finance. He understood what equity stakes in successful hospitality groups could mean. His expression shifted from surprise to something approaching awe. "Jesus Christ, Maya. Do you realize?" He stopped himself, glancing around at the family members who were all listening intently. "I mean, that's incredible. That's real wealth. Real wealth. As opposed to the fake wealth they'd assumed I was pretending to have." "Maya," Brad said, stepping closer with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for potential business contacts. "I'd love to talk to you about your expansion strategy. We work with several hospitality clients at the firm, and I'm always interested in learning about successful operational models." I almost laughed. 2 hours earlier, Brad had been suggesting that I might be able to get into a decent business school if I worked really hard. Now he wanted to pick my brain about operational strategies. "I'm sure you would," I said neutrally. Jessica moved to my side with the protective instincts of someone who'd suddenly realized her cousin might need shielding from opportunistic relatives. "Maya, why don't we get some air?" she suggested. "It's getting crowded over here." But I wasn't ready to be rescued. I was just getting started. "Actually, I'm curious about something," I said, looking around the circle of faces that were all watching me with this new intense interest. 5 minutes ago, when you thought I was still just working in restaurants, Anthony was explaining cryptocurrency to me like I'd never heard of Bitcoin. Now you want to discuss expansion strategies. What changed? "Well, obviously we didn't know about your position," Anthony said, looking slightly embarrassed. "But why would my position matter if you truly believed that restaurant work was valuable? If you really thought my experience was worth respecting?" The question hung in the air like an indictment. Because the answer was obvious to everyone. They hadn't respected my work when they thought it was just restaurant work. They only respected it now that they understood it was also corporate work. "Maya," my mother said softly, "that's not fair." "Isn't it?" I asked. "When I told you about managing staff, creating budgets, negotiating with vendors, developing operational systems, did any of you think those were business skills worth discussing? Or did you assume that because it was happening in a restaurant, it wasn't real business?" Uncle Robert shifted uncomfortably. "The restaurant industry is different." "How?" I asked. How is managing P&L for a restaurant different from managing P&L for any other business? How is staff development different? How is strategic planning different? He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. Because there was no good answer. The skills were the same. They'd just decided that the setting made them less valuable. You know what's funny? I continued, feeling a strange calm settle over me. For years, you've all been encouraging me to get into real business. You wanted me to get an MBA, to join a corporation, to climb the corporate ladder. Well, I did all of that. I just did it in an industry you didn't understand or respect. We respect the restaurant industry, Aunt Linda said quickly. Do you? Because when Emma's friend's mother, who works at one of our locations, recognized my name from a trade magazine, she was excited. She understood that being featured in industry publications meant something. But when I tried to tell you about those same features, you changed the subject. I could see Aunt Linda trying to remember the specific instances I was referring to, and failing. Because to her, my professional achievements had been background noise, not worth retaining. The difference, I said, is that she works in the industry. She understands what those achievements represent. You've spent years assuming that anything related to restaurants was automatically less important than anything related to traditional corporate environments. Maya, we're proud of you now, my father said, his voice carrying a pleading note. Isn't that what matters? Are you proud of me? Or are you proud that you can finally understand what I do in terms that make sense to you? The distinction was crucial, and I could see it landing with uncomfortable precision, because if you're proud of me now, that means you weren't proud of me before, which means your pride is conditional on my achievements fitting into categories you approve of. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. Maya's right. Everyone turned to look at Emma, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation with the serious attention children give to important family moments. At school, when kids talk about what their parents do, Maya always sounded the coolest, Emma continued with brutal honesty. She makes food and runs restaurants and travels to different cities for work. But whenever the grown-ups talked about her, they sounded worried, like she was doing something wrong. Jessica's face went pale. Emma, sweetheart. It's okay, Jess, I said. She's right. You were worried. You were all worried that I wasn't living up to some standard that none of you ever clearly defined. We wanted you to be secure, my mother said defensively. We wanted you to have stability. I have security. I have stability. I've had both for years. You just couldn't see it because it didn't look the way you expected it to look. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app that showed my investment portfolio. The screen displayed numbers that made Anthony whistle low under his breath. This is my 401k, I said, showing them the six-figure balance. This is my stock portfolio. This is my money market account. This is the money I have earmarked for expanding our locations in Connecticut next year. Uncle Robert stared at the screen like it might be a mirage. Maya, that's more than most people save in a lifetime. I know. I've been building this for 5 years while you are all worrying about my financial security. But how are we supposed to know? Jessica asked, frustration creeping into her voice. You never told us about any of this. I tried to tell you. Every time I mentioned business achievements, contract negotiations, expansion plans, staff development initiatives, you either didn't listen, or you suggested I should be doing something else instead. I could see them all searching their memories again, and this time finding the instances I was describing. The times they'd half-listened to my professional updates before redirecting the conversation to what they thought I should be doing with my life. We didn't realize, Aunt Linda said weakly. You didn't realize because you decided that success in restaurants couldn't be real success. You decided that someone who worked in food service couldn't possibly be building wealth, or developing business expertise, or creating something significant. That's not, Uncle Robert started. Uncle Robert, you've spent 30 years selling real estate. You understand residential and commercial property markets. You've built a successful business doing something you're good at. I paused, looking directly at him. But if I told you I'd sold $42 million worth of real estate this year, you'd be impressed. When I tell you I oversee $42 million in restaurant revenue, You assume I'm just a glorified waitress who got lucky. The comparison hit home because it was exact. The numbers were the same. The business skills were the same. The level of responsibility was the same. The only difference was the industry and their preconceived notions about what that industry represented. Maya, Brad said carefully, I think we owe you more than an apology. I think we owe you a complete reassessment. Do you? Or do you owe me the basic respect you should have been showing all along? The question was pointed, and Brad clearly hadn't expected it. He'd thought acknowledging his mistake would be enough to reset our relationship to something more comfortable. Because here's what I realized. Standing here listening to all of you scramble to understand how you could have been so wrong. You weren't wrong about my capabilities. You were wrong about my industry. And that's not the same thing. I looked around the circle of relatives who were all watching me with expressions ranging from shame to confusion to something that might have been admiration. You assumed that working in restaurants meant I was limited, struggling, making poor life choices. But I was never limited. I was building something in a field you didn't understand. And instead of asking questions or showing genuine interest, you decided that your lack of understanding meant there was nothing significant to understand. Maya, my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper, what can we do to fix this? You can start by understanding that this isn't something that gets fixed with an apology and a reset. This is about how you see me, how you see my work, how you see success. And those are fundamental things that don't change overnight. But we want to change, Jessica said earnestly. We want to understand. Do you? Because understanding would mean accepting that I've been successful all along, just not in ways you recognized. It would mean acknowledging that your quote, 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 a quote, a quote, 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 a quote, a quote, was actually judgment of my career. It would mean admitting that you were wrong not just about my current position, but about the value of everything I was building before this position. The weight of what I was asking them to confront settled over the group like a heavy blanket. I wasn't just asking them to celebrate my current success. I was asking them to reckon with years of subtle dismissal, casual concern, and well-meaning attempts to redirect my life towards something they could understand and approve of. And frankly, I added, I'm not sure all of you are ready for that level of honesty. Because some bridges, once burned, don't get rebuilt with good intentions and awkward apologies. Some relationships require a complete foundation reset. And some people, no matter how much they claim they want to change, aren't actually prepared to do the work that real change requires. The confrontation I'd been avoiding for years began with my mother's trembling voice. Maya, please. Can we talk privately? She stood at the edge of our circle, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. The confident matriarch who'd orchestrated family gatherings and managed holiday logistics for decades had been replaced by a woman who seemed genuinely afraid of her own daughter's response. We can talk right here, I said. Everything I've said has been in front of the family. I'm not going to whisper apologies in private so everyone can pretend this conversation never happened. That's not what I want, she said quickly. I just thought, maybe it would be easier. Easier for who? The question hung between us like a challenge. Because we both knew the answer. Easier for them. Easier for everyone who wanted to process this revelation without the discomfort of public accountability. Easier for all of us, Uncle Robert said, attempting to regain some control over the situation. Family matters should be discussed as a family. This is a family discussion, I replied. We're all here. We're all talking. What you want is a private discussion where you can manage the narrative and control the outcome. Uncle Robert's face flushed. Maya, that's not fair. We're trying to... To what? Fix this? Make it go away? Find a way to feel better about yourselves without actually confronting what you've done? What we've done? Aunt Linda's voice carried a note of indignation. Maya, we love you. We've always supported you. Maybe we didn't understand your work, but we never meant any harm. I turned to look at her directly. Aunt Linda, last Christmas, when I mentioned that I was negotiating a partnership with a restaurant group in Connecticut, what did you say? She blinked, clearly trying to remember. I don't recall the exact... You said, that sounds complicated, honey. Maybe you should find something simpler. Something simpler. Because you assumed that I wasn't capable of handling complexity. I was trying to be helpful, she said defensively. No, you were trying to protect me from what you assumed was my own poor judgment. There's a difference. I could see the discomfort spreading through the group like a contagion. These weren't abstract accusations. They were specific, remembered instances of the casual dismissal I'd experienced for years. And Brad, I continued, turning to Jessica's husband, when we were discussing real estate at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, and I mentioned that I was looking at commercial properties, what was your response? Brad shifted uncomfortably. I don't remember exactly. You asked if I'd considered the financial risk, as if I hadn't done basic due diligence. Then you offered to introduce me to, quote, someone who understands restaurant finances, so I could get proper advice. I was trying to help, he said, echoing Aunt Linda's defense. You were trying to help because you assumed I needed help. Because you assumed that someone in my position couldn't possibly understand commercial real estate or financial planning. Maya, Jessica interjected, we're not trying to make excuses. We're trying to understand how to move forward. Are you? Because moving forward requires understanding how we got here. And how we got here is through years of you all deciding that my success wasn't real success, my expertise wasn't real expertise, and my judgment wasn't worth respecting. I looked around the circle of faces, seeing varying degrees of shame, confusion, and resistance. You want to know what the most frustrating part has been? It's not that you underestimated me. People underestimate each other all the time. It's that you underestimated me consistently, repeatedly, even when I gave you evidence that your assumptions were wrong. My father stepped forward, his expression pained. Maya, we admit we made mistakes. We admit we didn't see what you were building. But we're seeing it now. Isn't that worth something? Dad, do you remember the conversation we had 3 years ago when I told you I was buying the condo in Manhattan? He nodded slowly. You asked me if I was sure I could afford the mortgage payments. Then you suggested I consider a studio apartment in Queens instead, something more realistic for your situation. I watched the memory register on his face, and with it, the realization of what his concern had actually communicated. My situation, Dad? You assumed that my situation was precarious, financially unstable, not solid enough to support a 2-bedroom condo in a good neighborhood. Even though I'd been working steadily for years, even though I'd never asked you for money, even though I'd been completely self-sufficient since college. I was worried about you taking on too much debt, he said quietly. No, you were worried that I was making decisions beyond my capabilities. There's a difference. If Jessica had told you she was buying the same condo, would you have questioned her financial judgment? The comparison was brutal, because it was exact. Jessica and I were the same age, both college-educated, both employed. The only difference was that her career path made sense to them and mine didn't. That's not the same thing, my mother said quickly. Why not? Because Jessica has a stable corporate job, and I had a stable business that I owned and operated, but you couldn't see that as stability, because it didn't fit your definition of what stable looked like. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but I was tired of softening the edges of this conversation for their comfort. Mom, every time I tried to share professional achievements with you, you responded with concern instead of congratulations. When I told you about industry recognition, you worried that I was working too hard. When I told you about expansion opportunities, you suggested I should focus on finding a more secure job. When I told you about financial milestones, you asked if I was saving enough for emergencies. I could see her trying to reframe these responses as maternal concern, but the pattern was undeniable. You responded to my success as if it was evidence of instability. You responded to my confidence as if it was evidence of recklessness. You responded to my expertise as if it was evidence of delusion. Maya, Uncle Robert said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when he wanted to end uncomfortable conversations. I think you're being a little unfair here. We're family. Family looks out for each other. Sometimes that means expressing concern when we think someone might be making risky choices. Risky choices, I repeated. Like what, Uncle Robert? Like starting a business? Like working in an industry you didn't understand? Like building wealth in ways that didn't conform to your expectations? Like turning down practical opportunities to chase uncertain dreams, he said, his earlier conciliatory tone giving way to something more defensive. What practical opportunities did I turn down? Well, when Marcus Henley, you remember Marcus from the country club, when he offered to get you an interview at his accounting firm, you weren't interested. I stared at him. Uncle Robert, that was 8 years ago. I was already running my own restaurant. You wanted me to leave a business I owned to take an entry-level position at an accounting firm. It would have been steady income, good benefits. It would have been a massive step backward for someone who was already generating steady income and building equity in their own business. The absurdity of the suggestion seemed to hit him for the first time. He'd been so focused on the security of traditional employment that he hadn't considered what I'd be giving up to accept it. But we didn't know about the equity, he said weakly, because you never asked about the equity. You never asked about the business model, the profit margins, the growth projections, the exit strategies. You assumed that because it was a restaurant, it couldn't be a real business. Maya, Jessica said softly, we didn't know how to ask those questions. Then you should have said that. You should have said, Maya, I don't understand your business, but I'd like to learn. Instead, you said, Maya, you should do something different. The distinction was crucial, and I could see it resonating with some of them. You made your lack of understanding my problem to solve instead of your limitation to address. Anthony spoke up for the first time since the revelation began. Maya, I work in finance. I could have asked better questions. I should have asked better questions. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, because I assumed that if you were doing something really significant, you would have told us about it differently. You would have made it sound more businesslike. How should I have told you about it? I don't know. With more jargon? More numbers? More of the kind of language we use in corporate environments? Anthony, I did use numbers. I told you about revenue growth, profit margins, expansion timelines. You just didn't recognize them as significant, because they were happening in restaurants. I could see him processing this, remembering conversations where I had, in fact, shared business metrics that he'd dismissed as unimportant. The language was there, I continued. The numbers were there, the business concepts were there. You just decided they didn't count because they weren't happening in an industry you respected. Maya, my mother said, her voice breaking slightly. What do you want from us? How do we fix this? I looked at her, seeing the genuine pain in her expression, and felt something in my chest loosen slightly. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a recognition that this conversation was hurting her in ways she hadn't expected. I want you to understand that this isn't something you can fix with good intentions and better behavior going forward. This is about fundamental assumptions you've made about me, about my judgment, about my capabilities, about what kind of success counts and what kind doesn't. I paused, looking around the circle of family members who were all waiting for me to tell them how to make this right. I want you to understand that I don't need your approval anymore. I needed it for years, and you didn't give it. So I learned to succeed without it. And now that you're offering it, it feels too little, too late. The silence that followed was the deepest we'd had all afternoon, because I'd just told them something that couldn't be argued with or negotiated around. I'd told them that their approval, which they'd assumed was always valuable and always wanted, had become irrelevant, and that was a truth none of them were prepared to hear. The phone call that changed everything came at 6:47 p.m., just as the uncomfortable silence from my last statement was beginning to stretch into something unbearable. My phone buzzed with a call from Marcus, my assistant, and I almost let it go to voicemail. But something about the timing felt significant, so I answered. Maya, I'm sorry to interrupt your family time, but we have a situation that needs your immediate attention, Marcus said, his voice carrying that particular urgency that meant real money was involved. What kind of situation? The consortium group wants to move up their timeline. They're flying in from Chicago tomorrow morning to discuss the Philadelphia expansion, and they specifically requested that you lead the presentation. This could be the deal that gets us into the Mid-Atlantic market. I felt every pair of eyes in my family watching me as I processed this information. The consortium group represented a partnership that could triple our footprint and establish Hudson River as a major player beyond the Northeast. How big is the deal? I asked, though I already knew my family was listening to every word. Initial investment of $12 million, with projections for $45 million in revenue across 6 locations over the next 3 years. Maya, this is the kind of opportunity that only comes around once. $12 million deal. $45 million in revenue. The numbers hung in the air like a challenge to everything my family had assumed about my little restaurant job. "I'll be there," I said. "Schedule the presentation for 2 p.m. I want our full expansion team present, plus legal and finance." "Already done. I've also booked you on the 6 a.m. flight back to LaGuardia. Car service will pick you up at 5:15. "Perfect. Send me the updated projections and the competitive analysis. I want to review everything before the meeting." "Already in your inbox. Maya, this is huge. This is the kind of deal that puts us in the same league as the major hospitality groups." I hung up and looked around the circle of family members who were all staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to something that might have been awe. "You're leaving?" my mother asked, her voice small. "I'm leaving," I confirmed. "I have a business to run." "But the reunion isn't over," Jessica said. "We haven't even had cake yet." "Jessica, I just told you that I don't need your approval anymore. Did you think that was theoretical?" The statement landed with the force I'd intended. Because this was the moment where words became actions. Where the independence I'd claimed was tested against the family obligations I'd been trained to prioritize. "Maya," Uncle Robert said, his voice carrying a pleading note I'd never heard before, "surely this meeting can wait. Family comes first." "Does it?" I asked. "Because for the past 10 years, you've all made it very clear that my work comes last. That my business decisions are questionable, my financial judgment is suspect, and my career choices are something to be concerned about rather than celebrated." I looked around the circle, seeing faces that were still processing the magnitude of what they'd just overheard. "A $12 million deal, Uncle Robert. That's not taking orders. That's giving them to people who control budgets larger than most small towns." "Maya, please," my father said. "We understand now. We see what you've built. Can't we start over?" "Start over?" I repeated. "Dad, I'm 32 years old. I've built a career, accumulated wealth, established myself as a leader in my industry. I don't get to start over. This is my life." "That's not what I meant," he said quickly. "Yes, it is. You want to start over because the version of me you've been relating to for the past decade turns out to be fiction. You want to pretend that your concern was always supportive, that your advice was always well-intentioned, that your dismissal was always loving." I pulled out my phone to check the time. "I need to go home and pack. I have a flight in 11 hours. "Maya, wait." The voice came from an unexpected source. "Emma." She walked over to me with the serious expression that children wear when they're about to say something they think is very important. "Are you mad at us?" she asked. I knelt down to her level, suddenly aware that this 7-year-old was the only person at this gathering who had seen me clearly from the beginning. "I'm not mad at you, Emma. You've been the only one who thought my job sounded cool." "But you're mad at the grown-ups?" I considered the question carefully. "I'm disappointed in the grown-ups. They made assumptions about me that weren't true, and they didn't ask questions that would have helped them understand." "Like when adults think kids can't do hard math?" she asked. "Exactly like that." Emma nodded sagely. "Adults do that a lot. They think they know things about you that they don't actually know." "That's very wise, Emma. Are you going to come to my birthday party next month?" The question caught me off guard. In the midst of this confrontation about respect and recognition, a child was asking for the simplest thing: my presence at her celebration. "Would you like me to?" "Yes. And I want you to tell everyone about your restaurants. I think it's cool that you're the boss of so many places." I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness for the adults who had spent years misunderstanding me, but recognition that the next generation didn't have to inherit those assumptions. "I'll be there," I promised. I stood up and looked around the circle one more time. These people who had raised me, celebrated with me, worried about me, and consistently underestimated me. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to really hear it," I said. "I don't hate you. I don't resent you. But I also don't need your approval anymore. I built something significant while you weren't paying attention, and that's not your fault. It's just the truth." "Maya," my mother started. I'm not finished, I said gently. I spent years wanting you to see me, to understand what I was building, to celebrate my successes the way you celebrated everyone else's. And when you didn't, I learned to celebrate them myself. I learned to validate my own work, to trust my own judgment, to build my own confidence. I paused, looking at each of them in turn. That's not a bad thing. That's actually the best thing that could have happened to me. Because now I don't make business decisions based on what will impress you. I don't choose opportunities based on what you'll understand. I don't measure my success by whether it fits into your definition of achievement. But we want to understand now, Jessica said. We want to be part of your success. Do you? Or do you want to feel better about yourselves by being associated with success you finally recognize? The question was sharp, but it needed to be asked, because there's a difference between supporting me and claiming credit for who I've become. There's a difference between celebrating my achievements and trying to retroactively pretend you always believed in them. Anthony stepped forward. Maya, what would it take for us to earn a real relationship with you going forward? The question was direct, honest, and more vulnerable than I'd expected from him. Time, I said simply. And consistency. And the understanding that you can't undo years of dismissal with a few months of newfound respect. But you'll give us a chance? My mother asked. I'll give you the same chance I give everyone else in business, I said. You'll be judged on your actions, not your intentions. You'll be evaluated on your consistency, not your promises. And you'll be held accountable for your behavior, not your excuses. The business language was intentional. I was laying out the terms of our relationship going forward in the same clear, measurable terms I used for professional partnerships. Maya, Uncle Robert said, his voice lacking its usual authority, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you respect, and I owe you the acknowledgement that I was wrong about everything. Yes, I said simply, you do. I didn't elaborate or soften the statement. Some truths needed to stand alone. I have to go, I said, checking my phone again. I have a presentation to prepare for. Will you call us after the meeting? Jessica asked. Let us know how it goes? Maybe, I said, if I remember. It wasn't cruel. It was honest. For years, they'd been the ones who forgot to ask about my professional life. Now they would know what it felt like to be an afterthought. I hugged Emma goodbye, nodded to the adults, and walked toward my car. As I reached the driveway, I heard footsteps behind me. Maya. It was my father, jogging to catch up. Dad, I really need to go. I know. I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. I've been proud of you this whole time. I just didn't know how to show it. I looked at him, seeing the genuine regret in his expression. Dad, if you were proud of me, you would have asked questions. You would have shown interest. You would have celebrated my achievements instead of worrying about my choices. I was afraid, he admitted. I was afraid of your industry, afraid of the risks, afraid you'd get hurt or fail or struggle. So I kept trying to guide you towards something that felt safer. Safer for who? For me, he said quietly. Safer for me to understand and support. It was the most honest thing he'd said all day. Thank you for telling me that, I said. That's the first thing anyone has said today that feels like the truth. Maya, I want to do better. I want to understand what you've built. I want to be the kind of father who celebrates your success instead of worrying about your choices. Then do better, I said. Don't tell me you want to change. Show me. I got in my car and drove away, leaving behind a family gathering that had started with casual dismissal and ended with the kind of truth-telling that changes relationships forever. As I drove back to the city, I thought about Emma's question. Are you mad at us? I wasn't mad anymore. I was free. Free from the need for their approval. Free from the weight of their expectations. Free from the exhaustion of constantly proving myself to people who had decided I wasn't worth paying attention to. The $12 million deal was just the beginning. There would be other opportunities, other expansions, other achievements. And for the first time in my life, I would pursue them without wondering whether my family would understand or approve. But not to Tori. I would pursue them because they were worth pursuing. And that, I realized, was the most valuable thing I'd learned from a family reunion, that had started with someone asking if I was still taking orders. I wasn't taking orders anymore. I was writing my own story. And it was going to be extraordinary. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.